Great morning to you all. Good to see you again. We have been and continue talking about this cycle of loving your neighbors. It's the second greatest commandment, to love your neighbors as yourself, which means getting into the lives of your neighbors and treating them the way that you would expect to be treated, no matter who they are, and then pointing them to God. It's our job to teach people who God is. It's not going to happen magically. We can't just pray and sprinkle fairy dust and expect people to know who God is. We've got to teach them who God is. And loving God is the greatest commandment in all of the universe. And that's loving God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And moving each other, as Christians, we've got to move each other to serve others. Faith without works is dead, and we, as we read in class this morning, Ephesians 2, we were created for good works. Our works don't get us to heaven. It's a work of God. It's God's grace that gets us to heaven, but we were created for good works. We were put here to serve other people. Our theme this year is becoming the hands and feet of Jesus. And the theme verses are from Matthew 25, 37 through 40. And the people asked, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you a drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me." Excuse me. Today we're talking about being the hands and feet of Jesus, being the hands of Jesus through compassion. Being a compassionate people. Now, I know we all, in our minds, we applaud that, and we're like, yeah, I have lots of compassion. I love compassion. I'm a compassionate person. But at the end of the day, exhaustion sometimes can rule the day. And exhaustion depletes our compassion meter and the amount of compassion that we have on people, let's be honest. The more tired we are, the more busy we are, the more irritable we are. And our compassion tends to diminish a little bit. This is a picture of what we're going to be talking about today. Xander read the scripture, part of the scripture that we're going to be reading today, where Jesus feeds the 5,000. I want you to kind of take a snapshot of this picture in your mind, because here you have the Sea of Galilee, which is actually a lake. They call it the Sea of Galilee. But it's about 11 miles north to south and 6 miles east to west. They are on the opposite side. So if you look, they have their backs to the water. Jesus and his disciples. They came from the west side of the lake and they came east. So they moved about 6 miles across from side to side. According to the scriptures, they were over on the other side and just needed to get away from people. And we're going to get into the text here in a little bit, but the people beat them to the opposite side of the lake. You could walk around the lake, but it's really difficult and it's a hard journey. And so I don't want you to look at the top of this lake and see this as like this super easy flat journey. And, where the sun is shining, that's the opposite side of the lake. No, it's 6 miles across. You cannot see the other side. This is just a little cove within the Sea of Galilee, but it is miles and miles to get across to the other side, whether by foot or by boat. This past week, if you've had any awareness whatsoever, you'd realize that LA is burning. There are horrific fires that have just swept thousands of acres. There right now, I think, are 5 or 6 different fires going on all at the same time, all around LA. The Pacific Palisades is wiped off the map. I mean, if you've seen the before and after pictures, in fact, I think I have some of those, but I want you to imagine what it's like for the people being here, especially on the water. This fire literally came up over the top of the mountain where it started. It dropped down over the side. It took out Pacific Palisades, and it just kept going all the way to it didn't have anything else left to burn. It literally burned houses that were on the beach on the water. They're gone. There's virtually nothing left in the Palisades, and then now it's spreading to other towns, and it is absolutely wiping out everything in its path. Everything. That's Pacific Palisades before. Very wealthy part of LA. A lot of actors and actresses live in the Palisades. A lot of them are mansions. They're expensive houses. Fires don't discriminate. Natural disasters don't discriminate. Poor people, rich people, it doesn't matter. We all are vulnerable just the same. This is an after shot just of, a couple blocks. But literally what the picture that you just saw, this is gone. Everything is gone. Every house, every business, gone. Completely leveled all the way to the very edge of the ocean. It's absolutely devastating. I'm listening to the stories of residents and just hearing the desperation, the loss of life. They're up to, I think, 17 confirmed deaths as of this morning. The loss of life, the firemen who are out there fighting these battles, some of them were going 92 hours with no sleep, just exhausted. The level of exhaustion, the level of emotional despair, the level of panic when you see people trying to drive through the infernos to get out because there's no escape. These things came super fast. They had 100-mile-an-hour Santa Ana winds that were pretty sustained on Tuesday when the fires began. And there's no way to fight. How do you fight that? How do you stop fires? How do you even slow down fires when you have 100-mile-an-hour winds flying up over the top of the mountain and coming down the other side? It's unstoppable. These fires are absolutely unstoppable. And it's not just the fires. In recent memory, if you remember, back in, I think it was October, it was 3 months ago now, we had the floods from Hurricane Helene. North Carolina got hit the hardest out of everybody. And as of this weekend, sadly, the FEMA vouchers have expired. They expired actually on Friday. So there are about 9,000 families that have been living in hotels ever since their entire towns disappeared off the map. 9,000 families times, 4 or 5 people on average per family, that's a lot of people. Their vouchers expired on Friday. FEMA extended them through yesterday, and they got hit with all this weather. We got a little bit of it this weekend, but the extreme temperatures, tons of snow. There are still families living in tents, lots of them, thousands of them. They were living in tents in North Carolina. And as of last night, these families were told, you got to be out. You got to figure it out. There are people working with local families, and I watched interviews with them, and they were in tears. They were sobbing. They were like, we don't know what we're going to do with these families. They can't survive. They cannot survive out in this weather. We can't dump them out in the streets. What do we do with them? What do we do with them? How do we help them? I saw interviews with some of the families who need housing, temporary housing. They're desperate. They're absolutely desperate. And people are saying, don't forget us in North Carolina. When you see this level of destruction and this level of despair, and these are just 2 small areas geographically. They're small areas, and you look at that despair and you're like, oh my goodness, it gives us anxiety in our comfort little place up here in our little bubble in Somerset County. We have it great up here. We really do. But it makes us anxious for these people because we're like, it's horrible, and how do we help them, and what's going to happen to all these people? Probably by now you're talking hundreds of thousands of people who are homeless between these 2 areas. And the fires rage on. There are more and more people. It is unbelievable what's happening right now. And there's a thing called compassion fatigue and exhaustion. And that's where we find ourselves at the beginning of the story that we're going to talk about today. So Jesus and his disciples, they're out ministering to people, and John the Baptist is beheaded. He gets captured. It's kind of a bizarre story, but he ends up, because of Herodias, he ends up being literally decapitated and his head is delivered on a platter. Kind of a gruesome way to die for somebody who is there to prepare the way for Jesus, the Christ. You think about his honor. I was just talking with Cameron and Xander before we started about the book of Habakkuk. And Habakkuk is complaining to God because the righteous people who are working so hard are experiencing health problems and poverty and oppression, while the oppressors are wealthy. They're comfortable. They're healthy. And Habakkuk is crying out to God. He's complaining to God, saying, why is it that the more righteous the people are, the harder life is for them? And it's tough. And Jesus and his disciples experienced the heartbreak of John the Baptist being beheaded. And in addition to that, they were so overwhelmed by the crowds coming to them, begging for help, begging for mercy, right? What people are experiencing here was happening on a huge scale. And they're coming to Jesus and his disciples saying, won't you help us? Please help us, heal us, help us, give us homes, give us clothing, give us food. We're hungry. We're literally starving. And we're going to read a little bit from Mark's account, but Mark says that the crowds pressed in so much that the disciples had no leisure to eat. They couldn't eat, they couldn't sleep. I imagine they were 92 plus hours without sleep. They were exhausted. And I'm going to kind of bounce back and forth between Matthew and Mark's accounts because they both tell a little bit of a different story about the same story. And I think sometimes it's important to look at different gospel accounts to get a better picture of what's going on. Here's how Matthew starts. Now when Jesus heard this, that is, he heard about John the Baptist. The disciples came, they reported to Jesus. Jesus, by the way, was up on a mountain by himself. He was praying for the very people the disciples were with, they were ministering to. He comes off the mountain, and his disciples drop the news on him. They say, John the Baptist has been killed. He was captured, he was beheaded. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. Do you know this never really jumped off the page at me before? I always pictured Jesus and his disciples together, getting in a boat together, crossing the Sea of Galilee together, and that's not what Matthew records, is it? When Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. Now remember that picture that I showed you at the beginning. They're on the opposite side of the Sea of Galilee. They hear that Jesus is jumping a boat. They kind of do the calculations and figure out there are only so many places he can go. They take off on foot. They go miles up around the Sea of Galilee, running. This is not like leisurely walking. They're not like, okay, we'll see him in a couple days. They're running on foot through treacherous territory. When the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot to the towns, from the towns. Verse 14, when he went ashore, not when they went ashore, when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd and he had compassion on them. And he healed their sick. We know the story. We know the end of the story. We know how many thousands of people are here. Thousands. Matthew says there were 5,000 besides for women and children. 5,000 men. You're looking at 15,000, 20,000 minimum. Jesus sees them after hearing the news of John the Baptist, after being grieved, after being exhausted, after being tired, after seeing the exhaustion on his disciples' faces, after knowing that the crowds are pressing in on them, that they can't even eat food, Jesus goes over, according to Matthew, by himself. He sees the crowd on the shore, and he had compassion on them. That's an amazing and interesting first response. I would have been livid. I would have turned that boat right back around, and I would have dropped anchor in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, and I would have stayed there probably for infinity. They would have been carrying my skeletons off to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. It gets more interesting. Verse 15. When it was evening, the disciples came to him. I always read that as they came to him from the side, beside him. They came to him to talk to him. I don't read it that way anymore. And you'll see why in a little bit. I think Jesus has been by himself until now, until the evening. This whole crowd, Jesus healing people, talking to people, ministering to people, I don't think his disciples were with them. And this is like a recent aha moment. I don't know why I never saw this before. Now when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place." Remember, you told us, go to a desolate place. We went to a desolate place. You took off on your boat. We went to a desolate place. This is a desolate place, and the day is now over. In other words, where's our rest? Look at all these people. It's overwhelming. Look at the amount of desperation and need on these people. We can't handle this, Jesus. The day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages to buy food for themselves. But Jesus said, they need not go away. You give them something to eat. Do you know how overwhelming that would have been for the disciples to hear that? They're looking at this sea of people, desperate people, hungry people, poor people, people that are ready to riot because the needs are so great. Tempers flare, by the way, when desperation increases. Tempers flare among desperate people. And Jesus turns to his disciples, who appear to most likely have just shown up. He says, no, you give them something to eat. I'm going to pause at verse 16, and I'm going to go back to a little bit of Mark's account. Here's what Mark says. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. This is back to the beginning of the story when they tell him about John the Baptist. And he said to them, come away by yourselves. Remember, Matthew's account says Jesus went away by himself. Mark's account says Jesus told them, go away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And I used to read this as Jesus and his disciples, they went away. I don't read it that way anymore. I think Jesus sent them across the Sea of Galilee by themselves. They didn't see the crowds initially. I think they spent a day resting on the opposite side. And they went away in a boat to a desolate place by themselves. Talking about the disciples. And then shifting back to Matthew's gospel, Jesus tells them, right, you go feed them. You figure it out. You feed them. And they said to him, we have only 5 loaves here and 2 fish. And he said, bring them here to me. Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces left over. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. We look at this story and we look at Jesus replicating food, producing food. We look at that as the miracle. I don't think that's a true miracle. I think the true miracle, though it certainly is a miracle, I think the true purpose of this story and the true miracle is the compassion that Jesus had on the people. That in the middle of all of this desperation and him and his disciples just working around the clock, is that they never gave up their compassion. They never stopped. That didn't take a rest. Physically, they took a rest, but the compassion, they didn't put that to bed. They didn't say, well, now's our time to be a little bit selfish, and we're going Jesus says, I'm going to turn this boat into a stretch limo, like the yacht of the sea. And we're going to go away and we're going to spend a couple days on an island and we're just going to chill out and we're going to kick up our feet because we've earned it. He didn't do that, did he? Compassion never took a break. His compassion never took a rest. And I'm looking at what's going on in Pacific Palisades, and I mentioned this in class this morning, and I'm looking at the insults that people are hurling at those people. Like, oh, Sin City, and they're hurling insults on LA, and I'm like, they need compassion right now. They lost everything. They're desperate. Families have been split apart in the confusion. They're still looking for family members. Can you imagine? Looking for, not having any idea whether your family member is alive or dead. Our compassion, if we're going to be the hands and the feet of Jesus, we really need to look like Jesus and not give compassion a rest. We can physically rest, but don't allow your compassion that's inside of you to ever stop. We need to be compassionate people. We need to be understanding. When things happen, when tragedies happen of all kinds, instead of pointing fingers, we need to stop, shut our mouth for a while, and stop before we think, or think before we talk. And we need to just reach out a hand. We need to have compassion on people. And my hope is, as I look around and I see these towns and cities coming together and helping each other out, I think that we are turning a point in this country. Where instead of a few years ago where we always saw were riots in the streets and people burning cities down and people just so angry all the time, I'm seeing a different picture with this stuff. I'm seeing people come out and helping their neighbors, like in droves. And I'm seeing people shift their rhetoric to not be so harsh anymore. And I'm starting to see that on a pretty big scale. And I have a lot of hope. I talk about my hope for the church all the time. I have a lot of hope for this country. I have a lot of hope that people's hearts are going to be softened. And that we have ample opportunity. We have so much opportunity to be the hands and the feet of Jesus and to look like Him to other people. And that's what I want to encourage you to do. I want to encourage you this week to extend compassion to people right within your own community. I'm not saying you have to go to Palisades or you have to go to North Carolina, but just for the people who are in front of you, exercise compassion on them and watch what God does with that. Watch how God blesses that. He will multiply that compassion. God is a multiplier of good things. He will multiply that compassion. And I don't want to leave you with that message this week. If there's anybody who has not taken that step to put Christ under baptism and you're ready, or if you have prayer needs, we'd encourage you to come up. We're all going to stand and sing this song together. DP.